Okay, I think we're going to get started now. OCO, thank you everyone for joining. I am Jenny Keller, the curatorial assistant at Gilcrease Museum, citizen of Cherokee Nation, and I am welcoming you from my home, which is in Muskogee Creek Nation, but not too far from the borders of the Osage and Cherokee Nations. I'd like to welcome folks from all over and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I'd also like to thank our very impressive guest speakers and moderator for joining us today. We're very grateful to have you here. So this panel is a part of a series of programming that we've been hosting since last fall for the exhibition, Weaving History into Art, the Enduring Legacy of Shan Goshorn. And this is actually the last panel for the exhibition programming schedule, and the exhibition is on view until March 28th. So just a couple more weeks. We hope you can come by safely and take advantage of it while it's here. So to clarify the title of this panel, we chose the hashtag MMIW. It's one of the older acronyms for this movement, but it is certainly an issue that encompasses more than adult women. Girls, trans, two-spirit persons are also affected. And while Indigenous peoples have resisted colonial violence against these populations since colonization began, the movement and the growing awareness around it is kind of what's relatively new, at least in the media. We are intending for this panel to run about an hour and a half, with the last 30 minutes or so for audience Q&A. So please be thinking of questions you'd like to address any of the panelists or moderator. And we also would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors and thank them for helping to fund this and other programming that has been part of this exhibition series. So thank you to the National Endowment for the Arts and to Cherokee Nation, both for their very generous contributions. We can't do what we do without you. And then one more note of housekeeping before we get in. There's a lot of heavy material that we may be discussing, and we just want to take a moment to recognize there may be some triggering data or information you see or hear. So if you feel yourself being overwhelmed, please take a moment and take care of yourself. So this program, during this panel, you will see several baskets that are in the Shan Goshorn exhibition. And one of the themes that the artist Shan was working to actively bring awareness to is this epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. She displayed her activism through basketry, and she used traditional Cherokee weaving designs, and she found that using these methods, these vessels, was a way to engage folks through these vessels that she couldn't do while she was speaking with them. The first image you saw a moment ago is one of the last forms that she created before she passed in December of 2018. And she called the basket squaw. And she was very purposeful about using that term for this basket. It's a violent term of disparaging connotation for Native women. The form itself is based on the iconic form of the Venus de Milo, which is a commonly used example of westernized feminine beauty. And then as we'll see later in the panel, it's woven on the interior with the names of missing women, but we will get more into that detail later in the panel. So let's get to the panel. It is my very great honor to introduce the panel moderator today, Cherokee Nation's First Lady, January Hoskin. She has served as First Lady of the Cherokee Nation since 2019, and in her role, she is a vocal advocate for the protection of the Indian Child Welfare Act and recruiting more foster homes for Cherokee children. She also champions other causes that are near and dear to her heart, such as missing and murdered Indigenous women, serving families in need after domestic violence, increasing drug treatment and rehabilitation opportunities, and protecting natural resources. She has a long history of advocacy for social justice issues. From Veneta, she attended the University of Oklahoma and is married to Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. Together, they have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. It is my great honor to introduce First Lady Hoskin. Hello and welcome to the panel.
Thank you, OCO. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm deeply honored to have the opportunity to moderate this panel today. Thank you, Gilcrease Museum, for hosting us and giving us this opportunity to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women. This is very important, and it's also very appropriate to do during Women's History Month. We have some amazing women here impacting Native communities and impacting the course of history, each in their own unique and positive ways. So first, we have Mary Kathryn Nagle joining us. Mary Kathryn Nagle is an enrolled citizen of Cherokee Nation and a playwright. Her play Sliver of a Full Moon has been performed at law schools across the United States, and she's received commissions from Arena Stage, the Rose Theater, Portland Center Stage, Denver Center for the Performing Arts, Yale Repertory Theatre, Roundhouse Theater, and the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. In 2019, her play Sovereignty was produced at Marin Theatre Company, and the Yale Repertory Theatre will produce MANAHATTA in 2020. She served as the first executive director of the Yale Indigenous Performing Arts Program from 2015 to 2019. Very impressive, Mary Kathryn Nagle.
Thank you.
You'll have to excuse me, I'm a little nervous, obviously. Nagle is also a partner at Pipestem Law, where she works to protect tribal sovereignty and the inherent right of Indian nations to protect their women and children from domestic violence and sexual assault, as well as missing and murdered Indigenous women. She has authored numerous briefs in federal appellate courts, including the United States Supreme Court. And we also have Representative Ruth Buffalo joining us. Representative Ruth Buffalo is a citizen of the MHA Nation and originally from Mandaree, North Dakota. As a public health professional, community organizer, and politician, Ruth has served in various capacities, focusing on building health and safe communities. She's currently in her freshman year as a North Dakota House State Representative for District 27. She has successfully introduced a package of bills focusing on missing and murdered Indigenous people and human trafficking prevention and awareness. She's the first Native American Democratic woman elected to the North Dakota legislature. And she serves as tribal navigator on the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force, in addition to have served on the Fargo Native American Commission, Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, and the Native Center for American Indian Enterprise Development. Next, we have Caroline Laporte. Carolyn, is it Carolyn or Caroline?
Caroline.
Caroline. Okay, I want to make sure I have that right. Sorry.
No worries at all.
She's an intermediate descendant of the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians. She attended the University of Miami Law School and Baylor University for her undergraduate studies. As an attorney currently working in Indian country, her professional experiences have been centered on violence against Native women. Caroline previously served as the Senior Native Affairs Policy Advisor for the National Indigenous Women's Resources Center and the Strong Hearts Native Helpline in DC. Her work focuses on the tribal sovereignty, jurisdictional issues, access to culturally based resources, missing and murdered Indigenous women, housing, human rights, firearms, and tribal justice systems, all within the gender-based violence framework. She currently serves on the American Bar Association's Criminal Justice Task Force on Victims of Crime, and she's a founding member of the National Working Group on Safe Housing for American Indians and Alaskan Natives, and author of their published report. She currently works for the Seminole Tribe of Florida and in the judiciary, and is an adjunct professor of the University of Miami. And finally, we have Jamie Black. Jamie Black is a multidisciplinary artist of the mixed Anishinaabe and European descent. Black's art practice engages in themes of memory, identity, place, and resistance, and is grounded in the understanding of the body and land as sources of cultural and spiritual knowledge. Thank all of you ladies for being here today. I've been looking forward to this panel for a very long time, and I'm so excited that we're finally all here together. I'm glad all of you who were watching are able to watch us with us today, and I'm sure that you will find it very inspiring and exciting, and you will learn so much. So we're going to jump right into our panel now. Is everybody ready? We're going to start off with Mary Kathryn. Mary Kathryn, what is one thing about the missing, murdered Indigenous women crisis that you think most people don't know or realize?
That is a great question, and thank you so much. I just want to say first, it's an honor to be here today with the Gilcrease, honoring what my dear friend Shan, who was an amazing Cherokee woman, Cherokee artist, who just did so much to fight for visibility for Native women and to end violence against Native women through her art and her advocacy, and to also be here with the First Lady of my nation, Cherokee Nation. It's really an honor that you would take the time on a weekend to be here for this important conversation. And all of the fellow advocates on this panel, I've met you some way, somehow through all the work that we do, and just an honor to be here today. So thank you. And I appreciate that question because it allows me to say something I really think is important about MMIW. And I say this as an attorney who has represented families of victims when they come to my law firm and say, can you help us? My daughter's been murdered, and no one at the local law enforcement office will return our phone calls. They won't meet with us. They haven't even interviewed us to see what evidence we have regarding her murder. And the FBI won't return our phone calls. What do we do? And for the families that I represent, and some of which has been very public, like for instance, Sarah Stops Pretty Places, her family has asked me to do interviews with the media. Other families have said, we want this to remain confidential because they're very concerned that the killer of their daughter is still loose and free for reasons that are very well explained. That person has political connections in that local community and is not going to be arrested or prosecuted for that murder. And the family is fearful for their lives that should it become known to that murderer that they're trying to get law enforcement to do something, that they themselves could also be murdered. And so in all of these cases where I've worked, in most of these cases, the family has a very clear idea who murdered their daughter. It's not some crazy mystery where it's like, gosh darn it, we've worked so hard to try to figure out who murdered her, we just can't figure it out. I'm sure that happens from time to time. And certainly we have our share in Indian country of stranger trafficking and stranger rape and murder, and these crimes can lead to homicide, and that is a problem. But a lot of times too, it's there's a history of domestic violence that led to homicide. It's an ex-boyfriend, it's an ex-husband, it's an intimate partner, or it's someone we know in the community, and there's evidence, there's eyewitnesses, there are people who have stories to share with law enforcement, but either law enforcement doesn't care. So for instance, in Sarah's case, her body was found off the reservation by half a mile. So the FBI should be investigating because she's a tribal citizen who lives on tribal lands, but they've said, well, half a mile off the reservation border, we don't have jurisdiction, which I don't think is necessarily true, especially when you haven't investigated where she was murdered. So you don't actually know that her life wasn't taken on the reservation. And then you look at the local law enforcement, for instance, the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office, and they have one of the highest rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and they're not doing anything about it because it's not a priority for them. They simply don't care. And so in most of these cases, the family could list the top 3 suspects. And in many of the cases, they know exactly who murdered their daughter. And so I think it's important that folks know that these rates aren't as high as they are simply because we can't solve the crimes. They're not unsolvable. There's a lot of evidence. It's just that law enforcement is choosing to not arrest and prosecute and investigate these crimes. And that's the real travesty here, because it has sent a very clear message, not just to our Native women and girls and our Two-Spirit relatives as well, and some of our men, our boys too, who are murdered and go missing, that their lives, because they're Native, don't matter, right? And it also informs the folks who do perpetrate these crimes that you can murder a Native woman or a Native child or a Native boy and get away with it. The authorities, especially in some places like Bighorn County, are just not going to investigate. So thank you so much for that question.
You're absolutely right. I actually did not know that so many of the families knew who the murderers were.
Yes,
and it's pretty educated on these issues, and I did not know.
And I've personally written letters to the FBI and to the local law enforcement on these families' behalf saying, we have eyewitnesses who were there. Please talk to us, and no response. So that's it's very alarming.
That is. Does anyone else have anything to add? Okay, we will, thank you, Mary. That was very enlightening, and I'm glad that you answered that the way you did. Blew my mind. Next, we will go to Representative Buffalo. Ready? Okay. How much of your work has been implemented through grassroots advocacy at the state legislative level? And can you talk about this work and what some of the differences might be for state policy as opposed to federal, perhaps using Savannah's Act as an example?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Madzigidads in the Hidatsa language. Nidoshadzi nakbaga o madashi mia adasheds mabe sigids madzigidads nakbaga o. It's good to be in this virtual space with all of you. It's a good day. Mabe sigids. And I also want to acknowledge the families of who have lost their loved ones. And also want to acknowledge the families that are in mourning. I think it's really important to do that, and I say that in a respectful and a good way. I also want to acknowledge the frontline workers, you know, who have been doing this work long before, years before, decades before, who have been advocating for safer and stronger communities and more protections for our communities. So I just want to really acknowledge those who have been doing this work prior. Myself, I don't consider myself an expert. I became strongly involved in advocating for MMIP, and I say P because we did introduce state legislation that includes all genders. So we went with people, missing and murdered Indigenous people. And that is now law here in North Dakota. We have about 4 different laws that focus on addressing the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit men, all genders. One focused particularly on law enforcement training regarding MMIP. And I apologize too, I don't mean to diminish any group or advocacy work prior to us saying MMIP here in North Dakota, but we just felt it was important to have a all-encompassing language in our North Dakota Century Code, so our state statutes and laws. The other one law is data collection. After digging deeper, we found that there were no data collection occurring in North Dakota, specifically of or regarding missing people, missing persons. Persons, we have to be careful because in North Dakota, in our Century Code, persons are also referred to as companies too. So just a side note with all the legalese, things that I'm learning so much about being a lawmaker. I'm in my sophomore year in North Dakota. We serve 4-year terms and we meet every other year, which is a challenge because I believe we need to meet every year. And so in my freshman year, I hit the ground running. I took a package of bills to Bismarck that were formulated or, brainstormed and really thought about from our local task force here in Fargo. So I'm kind of talking from like where we're at now to what led us on this path of policy change. So I mentioned I'm coming to you here from Fargo, North Dakota, along the Red River. And in 2017 of August, a young Indigenous mother went missing. She was 8 months along in her pregnancy. That's Savannah LaFontaine Graywind. Many of us found ourselves on the front lines helping with the search. And we stayed involved. We showed up to the court hearings. We advocated for the family. It was a very tough thing to be a part of, tough in terms of being very heavy with trauma, very traumatic. I think all of us, and I don't want to, paint us all with a broad stroke, but as Native Americans, we have a very low life expectancy. And so what that means to me is, many of us have lost loved ones long before their time, whether it's through a car crash or something that might have been prevented. And so anytime as a community member, we see a family in need, we, without hesitation, jump right in and offer whatever we can to help. And so from those efforts, we stayed involved, and we, within that week of the August 27th, we formed a local task force, and it was basically a local coalition. I had experience in forming substance use prevention coalitions on my homelands in the Mandan, Hidatsa Nation on Fort Berthold Indian Reservation years prior. And Fort Berthold has 6 different districts and segments. So in a former role, I was a substance use prevention coordinator for my tribal nation, and I was tasked with forming or enhancing community coalitions. And so that's kind of what, so I use that experience, I guess, in this role of community organizing and just pulling different people together. Any and all were welcome. We met the last Wednesday of every month at the Plains Art Museum, 4 p.m., rain or shine, even if there were just 2 of us. And what we found ourselves doing was really raising awareness at the community level. Many people weren't aware of the epidemic of MMIW, MMIP, MMIR. And so we just wanted to make sure that our community was well equipped should this happen again. We wanted to make sure that we had a plan in place, of course, not to duplicate law enforcement services, but to work in partnership at the grassroots level here in Fargo. And so we truly felt it in our gut that we needed to take action. We didn't want to waste time explaining to law enforcement that our loved ones, should they go missing, that they deserved a quick response, or that they deserve to be looked for in the first place. And so, and why we felt that in our gut is because we saw what unfolded here locally. And so that's why we took action. It wasn't for any other reasons, it was to just help keep our community safe. A lot of us who were searching together for the first time ever were moms, our moms, and so we just felt we wanted to find protections. Many of us are citizens of tribal nations, federally recognized tribes, but live off the reservation, just like Savannah, and her family were here in Fargo. So that's kind of, in summary, some of my experience and how I felt the need to help address this issue and to really help families and communities find justice. We would stand outside and below minus 30-degree wind chills, standing outside the district courthouse here in Cass County, just holding signs saying justice for Savannah, just to have a presence so that the community didn't forget, and the family also knew we were standing alongside them in solidarity. We stood outside the courthouses during the trials of the individuals that were responsible for her death and her murder. So.
That's very admirable. It's important that the community sees that support, and you go. Carolyn Laporte, you helped write Savannah's Law, is that correct? And
Actually, most of the people on this panel helped in one way or another. Yes, and also some people that are online too. I see a couple of names. I think we all, in one way or another, touched it, messed with it, cried over it. I'm not sure how we would word that.
My notes here say that you helped write Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act. And so I was curious if you had anything to add to this question. If
yeah, I mean, I think that so MK, Ruth, you guys can jump into, and anybody that's online and wants to put in the chat what they contributed to it as well. like what Ruth said, this was really came out of a grassroots effort, right? And so for those of us that were in DC at the time, I think it was more about harm reduction, right? So like what was in the bill that maybe had some unintended consequences, specifically for tribal law enforcement, right? Which we know is super understaffed, super underfunded, doesn't have access to really any of the same resources that local or federal law enforcement does. You know, and then just we're going to honor too what Ruth said about mothers being out and women being out, right? That it is a grassroots movement really rooted in matriarchal values, right? And I think that's really important. Not to say that anything else is not, but just that, you know, so much of it, right, was about honoring sort of our traditional worldviews in this space and what we felt around the Western response to the situation, which has really been very lacking, right? So what I think, you know, Representative Buffalo was, one, it was so amazing to see her take her oath of office. She, you know, like, I mean, I don't know, I feel like I'm fangirling a little bit over here, sorry, Representative Buffalo, but, you know, when you took your oath of office and you're in your elk tooth dress, like, it was one of those moments where you know, like, just kind of have to stand up and clap and recognize someone taking up that space and honoring that space in a good way. But one of the things that I think they also did in the grassroots space was their bill moved faster. I think, Mary Kathryn, is that correct? I mean, it's the state legislation on this went, you know, like Savannah's Act was just signed into law, I think October 10th of 2020. And I think we started that process in the beginning of 2018. And it just kept getting held up. I know Bob Goodlatte, Representative Goodlatte, tanked it in December of 2018. You know, and then once Heitkamp was out of office, we had to find new co-sponsors. I mean, it's, you know, it's kind of like, at least for me, it was a challenge, I think, as I was newer to this space and learning how to navigate, right, the federal like lobbying group, that whole space in general. But really what Savannah's Act was about, once they told us they weren't going to attach funding to it, and I mean specifically on the federal side, was about awareness, right? Awareness and harm reduction. So, I mean, and it does a few things, right? I mean, and I think everybody acknowledges that. There's pieces in there that talk about federal data collection. So, you know, what has federal data collection looked like thus far, right? Has it been one of erasure to a point when you can't when you're not putting someone's tribal enrollment information in, right? Or you're, you know, going the CNN route where you've got something else written and, you know, I mean, or you're listed as other, right? And then there's other key provisions that tell the Attorney General at the Department of Justice to establish like baseline guidelines and best practices regionally on how to respond to these things. And there's valid critiques of that, I will say. But I think for a lot of us, it was just about, it became an awareness bill. I think it became an awareness measure. And I know certain things that have come out of it are going to be really good now that this last version has gone through and is passed. But yeah, I mean, it's about data collection and it's about how the response is going to fall out when somebody has been killed or has gone missing. It's about making sure that law enforcement has a coordinated response to it. And it's about making sure they know who has jurisdiction, right? Which is another issue. I think, you know, MK, if you want to talk about that for a second, you know, I think the jurisdictional piece of it is key, right? And there's confusion around it and there really shouldn't be. We should be able to sort this out. And obviously, like, my big plug for that is that if you just do a full Oliphant fix, then, you know, we don't need to deal with these things anymore. But yeah, I mean, like, there should be information sharing amongst law enforcement agencies. And when they show up to investigate something or when they show up to be responsive to something, they should know who has what ball and when, period.
Would you like to respond, American?
Sure. You know, it's such a great point. And, you know, I know one thing that and a lot of times legislation, you know, there's not necessarily even bad intentions there. It's just not everyone is as educated on Indian law issues as we all are living in an Indian country. And I remember the first version of Heidi Heitkamp's bill would only require U.S. attorneys with Indian country jurisdiction within their jurisdiction to participate in having to create these MMIW or MMIP guidelines. And we all kind of take a look at that and we said, whoa, what about urban Native women, right? What if you're living in Chicago or Manhattan or Alaska, where the Supreme Court, unfortunately, in 1998 said there is no Indian country, which I think we can all disagree with doctrinally, but it is the law. And they have huge MMIP issues in Alaska. it's a huge issue up there, but they, you know, don't have Indian country technically, although perhaps Metlakatla would count. But in anyways, why would we want to leave it up to this ambiguity? And so I know NCAI, NIWRC, everyone advocated for an edit to the legislation to make sure that every single US attorney would have to create these MMIP guidelines. And it is a big deal because, you know, it is confusing in Indian country. It just is. It's unfortunate that in 1978, the Supreme Court eliminated tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians, and I think on faulty grounds. And my hope is that at some point, just like the Supreme Court in Brown v. Education overturned Plessy, that someday we will see the Supreme Court overturn Oliphant. But we might also see Congress legislatively fix it, and that's certainly a possibility. But until then, unfortunately, unless we've got 3 categories of tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians that were restored in VAWA 2013, and that's domestic violence, dating violence, and violation of protection orders. Unless it's one of those 3 crimes right now, and it's perpetrated by a non-Indian on tribal lands, tribes have no criminal jurisdiction to prosecute those crimes. And so sometimes that can create a situation. And then of course, you've got, you know, some situations where the state might have jurisdiction over the crime, and some situations where the U.S. Attorney's Office is going to have that jurisdiction. It does create some confusion, and that confusion costs lives, because when a Native woman or a Native child or a Native boy goes missing, and everyone's saying, well, who do we think kidnapped him or took him or murdered him or her? And you have to know that before you know which sovereign has jurisdiction. That prevents you from going straight into rescue mode and investigation mode, which needs to happen. And that's why so many times for our Native relatives, the first responders are our families and local grassroots communities. I will also say, though, what we have, and you can see this right now in Oklahoma with the 5 tribes, with Cherokee Nation, Creek Nation, Post-McGirt, we have lots of cross-deputization agreements, right? We work, tribal nations work with state and federal authorities. You know, there shouldn't be this gap, right? Because we understand that, okay, we can go out and investigate, and maybe at the end of the day, only the feds have jurisdiction. Well, we'll turn everything over to the feds. Or if only the state has jurisdiction, we'll just turn everything over to the state and let them prosecute and arrest, right? But so often what happens is the FBI in particular uses those jurisdictional issues as an excuse from having to do their jobs. And they'll say, oh. And so like in Sarah's case, they're like, well, we don't have jurisdiction off the reservation. And it's like, no. You definitely have the authority to investigate. You might not finally have the authority to prosecute. And then you would just turn over that evidence to whichever sovereign does have the authority, right? And so it's sort of twofold. The jurisdictional issues do prevent tribal nations from actually fully prosecuting many of these crimes. But then you'll see the state and the feds, and especially the FBI, use it as an excuse to not do their job. And that's, I think, when it can do a lot of harm.
Yeah, and like just to piggyback off of that, right? I mean, again, like when the feds don't do their job, but want to say to Indian country or want to say to tribal governments, no, we don't want you also doing it, right? It creates a very unique public safety and individual safety issue. And you have to ask what that's rooted in. You know, like why is that the case? If you yourself are not invested, and maybe that, you know, I mean, I can't, obviously I'm not speaking to individuals, but as a government, right, if you yourself are not going to invest resources towards this, or you are not going to step up prosecutions towards this, then why are you so concerned over whether or not tribal governments do it? Right? Like, what is that saying? And to me, I like have a really hard time not believing that is not rooted in racism, prejudice, and bias. And that's, I mean, to me, that's the crux of it. I'm getting a little amped up on this panel. Sorry.
That's fine. Express yourself. Jamie, do you have anything to add to this? Anyone else?
Hey everybody, I just wanted to, I'll just speak because I haven't yet, but I want to speak. I'll just say thank you so much for having me on this panel, and it's super amazing to be on this panel with you women. Your bios are like astounding, and it's really, really cool. Doing the work I do, I get to be on, you know, speak with and meet with such amazingly powerful women who are making change. And I just like, I have a tear in my eye for real. You can't see me because it's so dark, like where I would. But yeah, no, it's really amazing to be on here with you guys and hear what you have to say. And I'll also just say that, like, as someone who is not directly have their hands kind of in this sort of legal jurisdictional sort of thing, I think that it's really great to hear from you guys, like kind of that side of the story. And I'm super happy to, you know, to add in anything that has to do with, you know, community arts and activism or things like that if we get around to that space. But I'm just super happy to hear what you guys have to say, because it's also, you know, information being, I'm coming here to you guys from Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada too. So, you know, it's things I, you know, don't know the particulars of. And so it's very, very interesting to hear, you know, how things are kind of progressing in the United States around these issues too.
I feel much the same way you do, Jamie, and I'm honored to be here in the same space with all of you. And you, Jamie, I am in awe of artists, and I'm in awe of all of you ladies. So
We're all in awe of each other.
yes, we are, I think. At least I am in awe of all of you. I think we're going to move on to the next question now. And this one is for you, Caroline, sorry.
No worries.
We're going to change gears a bit. So often it seems that what consistently gets reported about missing and murdered Indigenous people is the data surrounding cases. Caroline, can we talk about the issues that often surround the lead up to missing and murdered Indigenous women or people, and how can we focus more on prevention?
Yeah, I think, I mean, and I just want to highlight too, there's so many people that I see like in the chat and in the like audience who are grassroots advocates that have worked on these issues like far longer than I have, probably before I was born. So if they want to like post something in the chat, I'm happy to read it out too, or someone else can read it later. But, you know, like I have come into this space thinking about it from a prevention framework, right? And I think you have to think about MMIW in terms of scope, in terms of where, in terms of who, right? We have to think about it in terms of prevention, intervention, and response though. And so like as to response, I think anybody will tell you that there are a lot of layers, and MK spoke a little bit about this, and I know Representative Buffalo did as well, but you know, there's obviously unreliable or inaccurate data in the federal space, which to me is a little bit of an intentional erasure. There's a lack of prosecution, like MK was discussing, even where the state or the feds do have that jurisdiction. And there's honestly a lack of outrage from the general public, which I think Representative Buffalo highlighted when she talked about, you know, the efforts that grassroots advocates and local Native individuals had to go through just to bring awareness to a case, even a case like Savannah's, right? But law enforcement's often confused about how to respond to these issues. There's concrete issues around information sharing. There's problems with how seriously law enforcement considers cases involving Native women, right? And that's as to response, right? So you kind of have like how the carceral system responds to things. There's a crux of policy issues. There's 1,000 different ways you could slice it, right? And then with regards to intervention, we also know to be true is that there's issues around the ways in which local law enforcement take missing persons reports, right? And the seriousness in which they pursue them. And MK talked about that too. So I know like MMIW families have repeatedly expressed their difficulty in either getting local law enforcement to accept a report or to take that report seriously enough to allocate resources or manpower towards it, right? So in other words, we have like in regards to intervention, we have a short window problem that we have to address. And it is important, right? But there's like a possibility to prevent a homicide within that window, right? So the time in between when a person goes missing and is killed is a window that we can focus on for policy reform. And that is still prevention work, but it's getting really close to the wire, right? So some law enforcement agencies have been repeatedly accused of making assumptions about why a Native person goes missing. Oftentimes those assumptions are, again, formed by underlying prejudice and bias, institutional bias, and very clearly disproportionately affects American Indians and Alaska Natives. So in that way, we know that it would be very beneficial. And as Representative Buffalo highlighted that for the bills that she did, right, that it's beneficial to establish minimum standards around police bias. And in fact, the United States Department of Justice issued such guidance under the Obama administration, specifically in relation to gender-based violence. And I think that's still available on on OVW's website, but everybody would have to check. But that is really like a framing of the issue that focuses on how to fix the Western approach to Western created problems, right? And we also know, as we discussed, that like for tribal local law enforcement, the issues surrounding response are compounded by a lack of resources for public safety. So we can't take like a one size fit approaches like for all, right? That we're gonna have to look at it individually. And I think someone pointed it out in the chat as well, but that, you know, like thinking about it from a local response and actually differentiating and distinguishing is going to be helpful. We talked about the confusion around who responds and when they respond. Savannah's Act has a provision that like focuses a little bit on that. But I also think we have to think about why the harm occurs in the first place. And so in order to have meaningful legislative reform around MMIW, we have to think about what our priorities are around prevention. So one of the things that I think about is that what we ask of law enforcement, that's about parity. That's about the norm, right? That shouldn't be the big ask. And it's sad that it is, because we're literally just asking, right, for the systems to do what they should do, right? Or what they say they're going to do. And the fact that we have to even ask for it's kind of heart-wrenching. And again, that speaks to why when we talk about the law enforcement response, we are asking for that parity. But the fact is that MMIW is about more than that. It's about how genocide and colonization have really informed and served as underpinnings in federal policy since time immemorial. It's about how those two things were based on the violent thought that land and bodies, particularly brown bodies and native land, could be owned and consumed, right? And it's about how long that thought has been allowed to persist in the general public's mindset. And it's also about how the feds really, truly, I mean, historically have not lived up to their trust responsibility to Native people. And so we have to look at all of those different things, right? One of the things that I think about within intervention, and MK hit on it a little bit, is to look at MMIW and its connection to gender-based violence. So if you know that 55%, and this is per the National Institute of Justice, if you know that 55% of Native women, American Indian, Alaska Native women, have experienced intimate partner violence, and you know, as I think was discussed on a previous slide, right, that I think it's 55% of those homicide cases per the CDC involve an intimate partner. So we know that there's high rates of gender-based violence, and then within the high rates of homicide, it's due to high rates, like that it's an intimate partner who's committing that crime, right? We also know that 38% of those individuals are killed by an intimate partner via a firearm, right? And so one of the main things I think about with prevention is around firearms. And many advocates, I believe many advocates in the chat will even corroborate how the mere existence of a firearm exponentially increases the risk of homicide to a survivor, and could delve into the many ways in which the presence of a firearm complicates their safety planning with a survivor. But beyond just sort of thinking, right, about like firearms by their nature increasing the risk of fatality, there's also serious gaps in how federal firearms prohibitors operate in Indian country. And so this is just like one, like I'm talking specifically about one policy recommendation that I think could make a difference in terms of prevention. And that's really just to increase tribes' access to federal databases like NCIC. And that's the National Crime Information Center. They hold multiple databases, one for missing, one for murder, but also the other thing that you can do, right, is you can actually, tribes who have access to NCIC can enter in orders of protection. And what that will do is it will trigger, if it's qualifying, it will trigger something called the Lautenberg Amendment, and it'll prevent somebody from purchasing a firearm or from purchasing ammunition, right? And we know that TAP works, like this program has worked. It's actually, I believe, the most, and there's individuals on this chat that maybe have updated stats, but I believe that it's, the most recent data is that it's blocked over 300 instances of unlawful purchase of a firearm. And so that's one like quick, like low-lying kind of fruit around prevention work that we could do. The other things that I think about are housing, right? Providing stable, affordable access to housing would be a really great way to think about prevention in this space. Shelter services for DV victims, especially if you think about the connection between MMIW and gender-based violence. You know, nationally, I think there are less than 60 tribally run shelters. And if you think about the exponential rates of violence that Native women experience, those 60 shelters are not going to be able to handle, right, the many people that need those services. And then you can think about it in regards to how there's 574 federally recognized tribes. So how are 60 tribal shelters going to cut it? And that has a lot to do with funding. You know, if tribes don't have access to things like the Crime Victims Fund, which the Victims of Crime Act created, VOCA funding, right? So since I think it was enacted in 1984, someone can correct me if that's wrong, but tribes were consistently shut out of this funding for the last 30 plus years, and it's led to really devastating impacts in terms of victim services. And so if we don't think about those things, right, and kind of how if we can just bolster advocacy, and people do this all the time, right? Like there's a VOCA fix coming up, there's, and most grassroots advocates who do gender-based violence know about all of these things I'm discussing. But to me, these are the things that we need to focus on for prevention. It's housing, it's even kids who are aging out of foster care, right? Like it's looking at all the many different layers in which MMIW, MMIP becomes an issue and really addressing those things. And lastly, and I'm gonna shut up and let other people talk, is that I think if we can look at it from a due diligence framework, from a more like a human rights perspective, then we can start to see how, okay, well, if we, in a human rights framework, we know that all of the rights work interconnectedly. If you don't have full realization of one, you don't have realization of any of them. And so if we can think about it in that framework, right, where we're approaching it more holistically, more broadly, I guess, and addressing the individual needs that a person has and how we can meet those needs in order to help them thrive and help their communities thrive, then we can see prevention, right? But, you know, and it's also about addressing mindsets of non-Indians who think they can come onto tribal land or elsewhere or in urban settings and just commit these crimes with impunity.
Absolutely. We're going to open this up to the rest of the panelists. And if you could share any work that you've done to address these issues or resources that would help people address these, just speak at will.
Yeah, I know you spoke about it a little bit earlier, First Lady, about the power of art. And I have to say, Jamie, the art that you're creating around these issues is so incredibly powerful. And I think it's been a while since I've actually gotten to hear you speak about it. I don't know if you could let folks know where your project will be next, or if it's still touring. I don't remember what's happening lately, and I hope COVID may have impacted your tour. But yeah, if you could just update us on where that's at.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, you guys. I feel like I'm in deep water here with all these legal lawyer people. Oh my goodness. But yeah, I mean, the red dresses are still really going strong, and one of the culminations of that recently has been the dresses were shown in Washington at the National Museum for the American Indian. So that really raised the profile of, of this project and of the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the United States. And I see you guys obviously, and those before you have been doing this work for so long. But I'm really glad to see the dresses traveling in the States, because I feel like, for some reason, I mean, who knows how these issues become more widely publicly known, but I think that the red dresses can help to make that happen, and to really show support for families, and also, bring people in who are not educated about what's going on, or just the public who has, often either misguided ideas about what's really happening on the ground in Indigenous communities, or, and provide them a space to be educated around that, and, and meet women like you guys who are doing this work, day in, day out. And yeah, so I'm really excited that the work has kind of moved into the United States more recently. And I think it's very necessary in that space, in a way that it sort of has become, I mean, it's not that it's not necessary here in Canada, but I think that the inquiry into missing women has really raised the profile of, you know, what families and communities are going through here on a really public level over the last few years. There hasn't been a lot of, yeah, sorry, yeah.
I hate to cut you off, but you're really, really getting the way into the next question that's for you. So.
Just let me go, I'm gonna go.
No. I want to kind of cut you off a little bit here because you're answering too much of the next question.
Okay. What's the next question?
Totally irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Mary Kay.
No, that's totally fine.
But the next question is for her. And
okay, sure.
But did you guys have anything else to say about the previous question?
I think I'm good. We can go ahead.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and ask your question then, Jamie Black. Having discussed so much about policy, we'd like to bring this conversation back around to the exhibit that helped drive this discussion today, Weaving History into Art, the Enduring Legacy of Shan Goshorn. Aside from policy, there's a great amount of work being done by artists in the communities who do their part to help raise awareness, while also creating beautiful works that speak to resiliency and power. Let's take another look at this basket, Squaw, by Shan Goshorn. We can see how Shan incorporated so many layers of meaning into this basket, the sculpture even. Ideals of feminine beauty, the intentions and continuing cultural memory associated with traditional Cherokee basket weaving, and the bold choice to take a harmful, ugly word and create it for the purposes of education and activism. You can just see the names of missing women printed in red on the inside of the basket. Jamie, what is the importance of the color red, and how is the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women movement represented through art? And how did you come to create the red dress movement?
Well, honestly, like the work itself sort of came to me as almost like a vision. So I saw red dresses in my mind's eye, and I really kind of had that idea while I was listening to some women speak about the high rates of violence Indigenous women and girls were experiencing here in Canada. And you know, I was listening to her speak, and I just thought she was so brave to speak up in the room she was in, which was a room full of generally white males who you know, had very little understanding of this issue at the time. And she stood up and spoke for our women. And when she did that, I was sitting in the audience and I witnessed that, and I just imagined red dresses just everywhere, so that we could no longer ignore this issue and the violence that our women are experiencing every day. And also just to kind of, you know, support families, because as you said, there's just so little, you know, support from law enforcement and other, you know, kind of structures. These colonial structures who are meant to provide safety are not doing so for our women and girls. And it has come down to, you know, families, like I've met families, and I'm sure you all have as well, you know, trying to find money to print off posters to find their own daughters. There's very, very little support. And, you know, I just felt like creating this work would really raise the profile of the issue itself, so that both the public could have access to understanding what was going on, and also the families would feel like they had circles of support and people who understood around them.
Why did you choose red?
How did I go around that topic? Well, honestly, like I didn't grow up learning traditional ceremony or anything like that, but I always kind of did a little bit of ceremony myself. And I always use red because I use red cloth, or I use red string or ribbon, or, and to me, it's the color of lifeblood. It's what animates us. It's who we are, and it's what connects all of us as well. You know, but using the color also is, you know, can bring the connotations of the violence that our women are experiencing. So it's both sides of that. I really think it's a color that's extremely powerful. And every time you're around those dresses, you can feel the power of that. I also, throughout doing this work, have kind of expanded and am willing to expand and learn about what this color means to different cultures and communities, because it is a very sacred color all across the globe, actually. And different communities have different stories of why that color is so powerful. But one of the stories that I heard in doing this work is a Dakota woman artist I know told me that red is the only color that the spirits can see. So it's really calling in the spirits of our women and allowing them to fight with us for justice.
I've actually heard that from Cherokees. Well, it's been very successful and had a huge impact on the movements. You see the red dresses everywhere. It's a kind of iconic, I guess.
Yeah, it's really traveled far and wide beyond what I ever would have imagined, for sure. And I really think of it as something that doesn't belong to me. It belongs to all of us, and it really belongs to all of our communities. And it's also not just a North American issue either. It's Indigenous land-based people have been under threat since colonization all around the globe. And I think those dresses again they really are standing with us as we fight for justice.
That's a very beautiful statement. It's a gift that you've given. I appreciate that. Would anyone else like to speak on this?
I mean, I just want to say too, like Jamie, I think that your work is really transformative and beautiful and impactful. And, I mean, MK, your plays too, right? Like there's so many ways in which Native women are utilizing art as a really serious advocacy tool. And it helps because these issues are really complicated, and they're complicated, right? And they also pose really bigger questions back to society about culpability. And I think that through art, it's easier to get people to humanize you and to see your side and to accept, right, that like this is all part of a larger past harm that's been ongoing. And the way that Jamie and other artists, like that you guys have been able to represent the impact of colonization, the impact of genocide, and also, right, like remember the stories of individual people that have been so impacted, individual families that have been so impacted. I think for me, like I think that's been one of the more moving things that I've seen.
I would just like to echo the comments as well. And I remember when we were in DC for a MMIW panel in front of Congress, and I was sitting alongside Mary Kathryn, and one of the congressmen in front of us mentioned, without knowing that it was Mary Kathryn's play that he actually attended. So it was a really powerful moment, because I remember her saying, that's exactly, if I understand it correctly, I don't want to misquote you, but that was one of the reasons why you did that work, was so that you could reach people that you might not have otherwise been able to reach, to educate of the issue and to maybe even sway hearts and minds. So I thought that was really powerful and testament to the work and the power in art, and the broad reach that it has. So I'm not sure if you want to speak to that too, Mary. Kathryn.
Thank you for mentioning that. And yeah, it was a crazy moment because we were there for this MMIW panel before the Indigenous Peoples Subcommittee there in the House, and Congressman Paul Cook just said to all of us Native women panelists, you know what, I don't know if you all have seen this play, but it's really informative and really educated me on these issues. It's about VAWA, and it's called Sliver, a Full Moon. And I saw this one staffer get really nervous and anxious, and he wrote on this piece of paper, the playwright's one of your panelists, and brought it up to him. And then he got all red and he was really embarrassed. He's like, I'm sorry, I should have known. But that's exactly what we as artists want, right? It's like, it's not about you, it's about the topic and the subject and the education and the opening of hearts and minds, and that you can be having this conversation with people that you haven't even met face to face before because they engage with the art. And I do think people are more likely to engage with art than they are a political conversation. And, you know, and I think that's what Shan's work is all about. And that's why her work has been so impactful, is that she took these really challenging concepts like MMIP and tribal sovereignty and, you know, treaty rights and all these things that, you know, I think are really hard, especially for our non-Native community members and neighbors to really truly understand. And she put them in this beautiful work of art that really had, you know, inspired people to just lean in and say, what is this about? This is beautiful. I'd like to understand it better. And that's really, really the power of art.
She was an amazing person, and her art reflected that, I have to say. I have one more bonus question for you ladies. What would you say to people that are tuning in that haven't had any history with this movement, but have been inspired today and would like to start somewhere at the grassroots level? What would you say to them? How to get started? How might they jump in and do something? What would you recommend to them? Maybe a rally, if there's a rally they could go to go. I mean, that's something I could toss out there.
Well, in Oklahoma, if folks are in Oklahoma, folks I realize could be tuning in from anywhere, which is sort of the blessing of our virtual existence right now. You know, the Native Americans Against Violence, NAV, is an incredible grassroots organization doing incredible work on the ground to save the lives of Native women. And so I would encourage folks in Oklahoma, if you're really excited to help out, to reach out to NAV, NAAV, and you can just Google them and you'll locate them. They're doing incredible work. And I also know Cherokee Nation and Muskogee Creek Nation are doing really important work with the U.S. Attorney's Office there to implement Savannah's Act, and they're two of the tribal nations doing the pilot project. So, and I know that, you know, our DV advocates at both of those tribal nations are just excellent, wonderful folks. And, you know, supporting the work that they're doing is another really great opportunity to reach out to your, you know, if you're a citizen of a tribal nation, great, help your tribal nation tackle this issue. If you're a resident on a reservation or living near a tribal nation, reaching out to their leadership or their DV program is another really great way. And then I'll give a really short shout out to some of the national organizations I've been blessed to work with. National Indigenous Women's Resource Center is doing really critical national work to address these issues. And you can go to their website and support them there, niwrc.org. Also, you know, UIHI, the Urban Indian Health Institute, which is led by Abigail Echohawk, is doing really critical work on, as she would explain it, decolonizing data. And they do really critical work, as well as Sovereign Bodies Institute, which runs their national database and does a lot of advocacy, SBI, on behalf of MMIW, MMIP families. So those are just a few. There are many, many, many organizations doing really critical work, but those are some great options if you want to reach out, get connected, and figure out how to support the movement.
Yeah, and I would just
have an interesting idea. I'm sorry.
I don't know, go ahead, Jamie. No, please.
Any interesting ideas, Jamie? Maybe do some art. Okay. What were you going to say, Caroline?
So I always plug Robin Wall Kimmerer's book. I feel like I should be her hype man at this point. She should pay me to do that. But one of the things, it reminded me of what Jamie said a minute ago. One of the things that she talks about in Braiding Sweetgrass is that part of what creator tells us to do, and like part of what in Anishinaabe, and Jamie, I think you'll respect this because I'm also Anishinaabe, that one of the things that Sky Woman tells us to do in her creation story, one of the things that we learn from it, right, is that we all have gifts, and it's our responsibility to use those gifts in a way that benefits other people, and not just people, but also land and non-human kinship as well, right? And so I think one of the things people can do is just like think about what you bring to the movement, right? It can be anything. It can be law. It can be, you can be a boring lawyer. You could be an amazing artist. You could be an incredible playwright. You could be somebody that does SART, like sexual assault response teams, or SANE, a nurse examiner. whatever it is that your gift is, right? Just think about how you can bring that into the movement. And I promise you, you will be inherently valued and uplifted in the space, because the movement is not just one thing, right? It's so many different, it's social work, right? It's teachers. There's so many different spaces that you can be, ways actually that you can be an advocate in this space. And so, you know, I just kind of want to uplift that a little bit, I guess, but definitely echo what MK said, like, go to the tribal coalitions, right? The local people who are doing the work, like how Ruth approached her work. She did the, you know, it was like, go to the community that's being impacted, ask them what you can do. And then certainly, right, VAWA, like the Violence Against Women Act, needs to be reauthorized and passed. Like that's an urgent thing. There's a VOCA fix on the table this week. I think there's a FIPSA reauthorization happening next week. You know, start calling your senators, start calling your Congress representatives, write them letters. And then I think another big thing, right, is just to fingers crossed that Deb Haaland's nomination goes through right next week. I believe that it is supposed to, since she's been through the Senate now, but that's going to have a really big impact in the space too.
Thank you for saying all that. And that's what I feel like is really important, is you don't have to be gifted in politics or law to be involved. Whatever you do, you can bring that and make a difference. And that's why it's just so important. This whole thing is about art, and she was a gifted artist, and she made such an impact with her art and touched so many people. And you know, we're still celebrating her today because of the impact that Shan made with her art. And this, everyone can make a difference. So thank you for that.
Can I just add to that too, just a little thing before we move on? Is that good?
Yeah, sure.
We got time for that?
Definitely.
Yeah, I just wanted to say too, and I mean, Carolyn, I've been actually listening to that book as an audiobook, Braiding Sweetgrass, and I mean, it's amazing. It's so amazing. I keep crying. So it's just so profound, but it's also like very, very simple and rooted and grounded in simplicity. And what I just wanted to add to what we were just talking about is, you know, think about also the ways that how we can decolonize ourselves. So like what inherent in us is causing us to act in ways that are destructive to others, and what inherent in us is causing us to act in good ways, in good relation with each other. Because I think a lot of the time we ignore that part, and I think the healing does need to begin within ourselves, and we can do both things simultaneously, but I just wanted to draw our attention to that too, in our own healing and our own you know, kind of, I feel like kindness is an antidote that's so simple. Like it's just so simple, and just valuing other humans and having care for each other in the face of a system that does not have care is a simple act you could do today. You know, to anyone that you encounter, and that you come, and you don't need to, I feel like we don't need to make this huge sweeping change today, because I think that puts a lot of pressure on, well, all of us probably, right? And because it feels very urgent, but I think we do have the capacity to make small changes that, you know, you may not be able to measure it, but that make a really huge impact. And just, we can turn, you know, these systems on their head just by being generous in the face of greed, just by being kind in the face of hatred, and things like very, very simple kind of human, you know, making human connections that are valuable.
I kind of wanted to add to that. Thank you for sharing that, Jamie, because it's so important. You know, kind of goes back to like what I think of when you're speaking is like being a good relative. And I think, you know, the question of what would you tell someone who wants to get involved, and I think of myself when I first got involved with the movement of MMIW, MMIP. Nobody really warned me and said, you know, you're going to be a target, because that's an unfortunate piece of the puzzle, that people may question your intentions, even now more so being a politician. And before I ran a second time for office, I remember sitting down thinking long and hard, is this something I want to do? Because I don't want my community work, my what I consider to be good community work, to be discredited. But at the same time, you know, doing the pros and cons, weighing out the options there, I didn't believe or see anybody in our North Dakota state legislature that was truly representing myself, my family, my community. And so I just felt that I needed to take the plunge, you know, and again, so back to that original question, also what popped in my head was like, turtle shell, put a turtle shell on. You know, that's kind of some of the unintended consequences, I think, that are there when you do dive in, wanting to help. You don't think of the unintended consequences of being pushed out to be the one in the front, you know, with all of the media things that we saw here locally. And I was also a member of the Fargo Native American Commission, and I was new to the commission. So being the newbie, all of those that were veterans on that commission would push me out in front. No, you go do the media interview. But now I see, because then you're out in front and then you're the target. You know, so unfortunately, that's some of the things that are real, that we have to navigate through in our communities, but not losing sight of the main goal, to help people, you know, to improve the quality of life, you know, to make sure that our social determinants of health are addressed. But back to the art piece, I do want to share real quick something that we did here locally, that was started in 2014, 2015, was a Singar Rivers Red group, who really worked hard to mobilize our communities here. We focused on the Red River, and missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so there was a lot of community events that took place. And one of them was a missing, you know, earring. You know, as women, I think sometimes we always lose one pair of earrings. So they put a call to action, please donate one-sided earrings to this huge earring exhibit. It was phenomenal, very huge, striking earring exhibit that now travels across Turtle Island or across the United States to raise awareness for MMIP, MMIW, MMIR, Two-Spirit girls, boys. And so what we wanted to do here locally, after we formed our local task force, we wanted to have something here to raise awareness. So we had sought permission from the Sing Our Rivers Red group, and they were happy that we reached out and were excited. So we, with their blessing, we created a local earring exhibit here, but we had one of our local task force members sew a dress, a red dress, and then it had lines to kind of represent the jingles of a jingle dress. So we put another call to action out there, local one-sided earrings, and we put the one-sided earrings on the trim, you know, the lines that would be a jingle dress, signifying the jingle dress, and also recognizing and uplifting the importance of healing. So I think, you know, the healing component is so important, because truthfully, I don't know that I would be able to do another search, because it is a very traumatic thing to be a part of. And so I think the healing component also needs to be front and center when we're doing this work, this heavy work, and acknowledging those that have been doing this work long before any of us too. So I really want to stress that healing is so important. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for all of your insight today. I have been educated and enlightened, and I'm glad to know all of you now. I think it's time for Jenny to come and take over.
Yes, thank you all so much for sharing. We have some questions from the chat, and a reminder to folks, if you do have something, please submit them to the question and answer there at the bottom of the screen. And there have been a couple that I wanted to ask that kind of is directly involved in the McGirt decision, folks wanting to know how that might impact this movement in a positive manner. Would somebody, maybe Mary Kathryn, to get started, address
Sure.
this? Sure, go for it.
Look, you know, anytime the United States Supreme Court applies the law to a question of Indian law, instead of perhaps white settler expectations of tribal sovereignty diminishment to reach a decision, it's a huge victory for us, and it's a good thing for safety for Native women and children and all of our relatives. So yes, I think there is ample opportunity here for this McGirt decision to result in increased safety as it relates to MMIP in Oklahoma, specifically because, one, it affirms what we already knew, right? Tribal nations in Oklahoma, their reservations have never been disestablished. They're still in existence. So that doesn't quite eliminate state authority jurisdiction the way some people mistakenly think that it does. The state still has criminal jurisdiction authority over the vast majority of crimes that are committed on or off a reservation within the state of Oklahoma. But what McGirt does do is it clarifies that there isn't this confusion that Oklahoma said there was around reservation boundaries. And so under VAWA, which we currently have on the books, because that clarification has been offered, we are certain that if a Native woman is being beaten or abused within the borders of a reservation in Oklahoma, like Creek Nation or Cherokee Nation, then she can, if her perpetrator is Native or non-Native, doesn't matter. Her tribal nation still has criminal jurisdiction to protect her. If the Supreme Court had taken Oklahoma's bait and broken precedent, which is what it would have required, and suddenly judicially disestablished a reservation that Congress had never disestablished, and Oklahoma had won McGirt, then, for instance, Muskogee Creek women living within the board in their own homes within the borders of their nation, if they lived on land that was not in trust and they called Light Horse Police would, Creek Nation would not have criminal jurisdiction over their non-Indian spouse or dating partner or whatever the intimate relationship might be if that person was beating her because of the status of the land. And so we're very thankful that the Supreme Court, by upholding the continued existence of the Muskogee Creek Nation Reservation, is really affirming the continued existence of that nation's sovereignty, right? And I think what we're seeing now is that tribal nations know how to collaborate with other sovereign governments, right? We've been doing that diplomatically for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so while this might be a little bit of an adjustment for the feds and the state to kind of figure out how to really bring themselves into full compliance with the law and who has jurisdiction over what, it's a great opportunity for these three sovereigns to really work together. Because what we've done here is no one's really lost a large amount of jurisdiction as a result of McGirt. That's simply not the case. And if Oklahoma states that, they're just wrong. But what is, it's an actual opportunity for tribes to step up and exercise their sovereignty in ways in which before others might have called it into question. And I think it's a real opportunity for our Native women who are citizens of these nations to say, here's what our tribal leadership needs to do. Here are the steps we need to take. And I know specifically the Muskogee Creek Nation has a Reservation Protection Commission and has a specific committee that is looking into those issues, right? How do we update our tribal code? How do we better prepare our tribal court judges, our DV advocates? How do we address this? And we've already seen it happening. We've already had Native women go missing in the state post McGirt. And I will tell you that Light Horse and, our DV advocates within tribal nations have been working hand in hand with the U.S. Attorney's Office to say, all right, we got to contact the BIA police. We got to reach out to that local county and get them activated. And we've really seen, I would say, a higher degree of collaboration post McGirt than we had pre McGirt. So I do think we're going to see it. McGirt is a good thing. It is a good thing for natives and non-natives in Oklahoma for sure.
I would just also add to that less poetically than MK just did, that one of the things that I think the McGirt decision did, not just for issues like this, but just Indian country issues generally, is that it signaled to everybody who brings cases to the Supreme Court that there is now somebody who is a justice who has an understanding of federal Indian law. And to me, that was also a huge impact of that case, right? Was that you're not going to be able to go to the Supreme Court anymore and pull a sneaky and get something crappy put into judicial precedent that's going to impact the rest of Indian country without really first getting it past somebody that at the very least, has a foundational understanding of these issues. And I would obviously argue that he has much more than a foundational understanding, but that's not going to be something that's happening anymore, hopefully. It's at least not going to be easy to do.
Great, thank you. Quick question for Jamie. Do the dresses have names for any of the dresses in the Red Dress Project?
So when I began the project, I decided actually not to put names on the dresses for several reasons. And actually throughout kind of doing the work, I have had people request that I put names on them. And I'll just say, like, the reason that I didn't choose to put names on the dresses from the beginning is because I didn't feel like it was my place to be naming women I didn't know personally. And I was not part of their families. And so if I had blessings from individual families, I would be happy to do that as part of the project. But I feel like without that, it's not really my place. And, you know, at the time, it was really important to, I understand and I know that everyone is, you know, is valuable and important, and that naming is a very powerful thing to do. But I think at the beginning of the project, it was really about thinking about the, you know, the scope of the violence that's happening on a really large scale. And so I was thinking about the, you know, really the kind of critical mass of these dresses having the impact I was looking for.
Thank you. Here's another question. Since missing is not a crime, missing adult persons are not being prioritized. When there's a body found and they all jump on board, how do we get them to have urgency on the report of missing? This is a huge gap. Open question.
Well, I would say one thing really quick is, like, you know, Savannah's Act is not perfect. Like Caroline mentioned before, we found out sort of early on in the drafting that no funding would be attached to it, which is, again, you know, like our tribal law enforcement needs funding, and that could be we could talk for an hour about that. But aside from that, what this opportunity is, we have an opportunity to create guidelines. Those guidelines should say missing needs to be treated as a crime. There's no such thing as a report, you know, receiving as law enforcement. You cannot receive a report that someone's missing and say, oh, well, she's probably out partying. It doesn't matter. There's no, you know, which is often the incorrect excuse that law enforcement will give to blame the victim when they've actually been kidnapped or murdered or trafficked. And so these guidelines that are being created, you know, I'm not sure, it'll be interesting to see what happens. I don't think any of us anticipated Savannah's Act being signed into law by President Trump like a month before the elections, and then a whole transition. And the Biden administration is very committed to these issues. And I know several folks who are working now in the Biden administration who are committed to these issues, but you know, the statutory deadlines for when consultation is supposed to take place and when the guidelines are supposed to be published, I'm not sure if the DOJ currently is moving towards that or what's happening. There's a little bit of lack of clarity during the transition around all of this, but I think we all need to advocate with our local U.S. Attorney's Office and have a voice in how these guidelines are drafted. And they need to deal with missing, because you're right, way too often, right? The response is, oh, she'll come home. She'll come home eventually. And that's not the case at all, right? And they can't treat it like that, because then that costs lives. So I think we just have to advocate right now while these guidelines are being drafted.
I second that. I would say, like, regardless of whether or not it's a crime, it matters. Like if somebody goes missing, it's law enforcement's job to take that report seriously. I mean, what if you had an Amber Alert and they were just like, I don't know that a crime is really indicated. I know a child is missing, but I'm not really sure. I mean, you can't, you know, that's not, you don't do that. That's not how that's supposed to work. And like MK said, like, it's not law enforcement's job to place qualifiers around something. It's not their job to decide whether or not something is serious, right? It's take the report and put the resources behind it.
Yeah, I would add to that, locally, you know, just really educating the people that are within these systems, and trying to find the best way forward, asking the tough questions. You know, I often think and wonder why locally here, I feel like we're still continuing, I believe we're still spinning our wheels within addressing human trafficking. Unfortunately, the majority of our human trafficking cases in North Dakota are Native youth. And kind of what Caroline mentioned earlier, you know, when we look at prevention and trying to find upstream solutions or root causes, and how do we how do we address the gaps within the system? And I think of individuals who are timing out of foster care or who are not with their tribes. You know, their tribe is not the custodian, or it's a state or a county entity, and the gaps within that system. And oftentimes what I'm seeing locally is that people or folks within these systems oftentimes are complacent and are upholding these systems that contribute to the issues that we see. So I think really finding a way to address these issues and asking the tough questions, and because there's still so much work to be done here locally in North Dakota in terms of taking action or just not being complacent when someone goes missing, and making sure the key stakeholders are at the table, you know, including tribal nations, even if they're not listed as a custodian, but there's still a connection there that needs to happen. So somehow finding a way to break down the silos as well, but then the lack of cultural responsiveness as well, I think is important. So thank you.
Yeah, I know we're about out of time, but I think that just made me remember one more point that I think on missing is so important, right? Is that what we hear a lot from law enforcement is, oh, that child or that teenager ran away. Even if she or he did, you don't run away from home unless you're not safe, right? So the reason someone is running away, if they are truly running away, is that they're probably the victim of abuse. And so we need to help them and support them. They need victim services, victim advocacy, and law enforcement has a job to do. It's not just, oh, you know, she's 18 years old and ran away. And the other issue too is that when our Native youth or younger folks do run away because they're living in a dangerous situation where they're not safe, that is when they're at higher risk of trafficking and other crimes of being committed against them. And so again, and you wouldn't hear this, right, if it was a young white girl from a very rich family in a nice neighborhood. The law enforcement wouldn't say, oh, but we think she ran away. It would be like, oh my God, we better find her and bring her back, right? So again, these are all things that we need. We have a lot of educating to do, especially with our state, local county sheriff's offices and the U.S. Attorney's offices. And hopefully the Savannah's Act might provide a vehicle for some of that education.
We are nearing the end. I have one question that you've all sort of touched on in little bits, but just as a final thought, there's lots of general support for a lot of your statements in the chat, and we'll share all that with everybody. But there's a comment from someone who says that they're a PhD student working with a young group of Cherokee women to advocate for MMIW work. Any words of encouragement for young people and students seeking change? I would ask that to each of you.
I feel like everyone's waiting for me to talk right now. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of power in working together as groups to really address a lot of these things, and becoming allies to communities and groups who are already doing this sort of work. And as we kind of mentioned in the panel, there's so many different ways to support, and there's so many different ways to share, you know, what you have to give to and with the community. You know, that could mean you're just, you know, like maybe you're making bannock, you know, for everybody who's, you know, doing this work every day. Or, I mean, there's many different ways that you can really show support and I mean, there's art-based actions as well, which is also great. And I mean, just I think look around also to, you know, all the different ways in which, you know, it's possible to bring forward these issues in kind of different vehicles and different ways, and just push forward, you know, coming from the skill base that you have and working with your group.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. I want to say a big thank you, Wado, to everybody who has participated today.
You're on mute, Jenny.
Sorry. Thank you again just to everybody, Big Wado, for joining, for the people who's tuned in. Thank you to our incredible, beautiful, wonderful panelists, our wonderful moderator. First Lady, thank you so much for taking the time, everyone. This is so much information we need to talk about, and we're happy to have a safe space to have these conversations in to help instigate more change. All of the links and resources that were shared today, we'll have them on a site on our website soon. So if anyone had any questions on what was that place, the resource you mentioned, we'll have a link to those for anybody who's looking. We also have the Red Dress Project is on view now, both on Gilcrease grounds and at the Guthrie Green, both here in Tulsa. They'll be up through this weekend through the 14th. So if you have some time and want to spend a moment with these pieces, this installation is so powerful. And thank you, Jamie, for working with us to bring this here to Tulsa. We're very grateful. The exhibition, again, closes March 28th. Come by if you can see it. And one final thank you to NEA and to Cherokee Nation for sponsoring this. Thank you all so much. Have a great day.